Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Sarah and I am a clarinet and a recorder player. Today I am going to be discussing the exciting world of different recorder fingering systems. Well, to some it probably isn't actually that interesting. If you're looking to buy a recorder and you have no idea what different fingering systems do, hopefully this video helps inform you a little bit. Likewise, if you've been gifted a recorder and the fingerings that you've used on previous recorders isn't working, I might be able to help answer a few questions. So I'm going to be discussing 3 different types of recorder fingering system today. Well, most people discuss 2, and they discuss German and then Baroque. I'm going to be discussing historical, German and modern, because I'll get there in a bit, but I find that the term Baroque is a little bit incorrect. Historical recorders are, these days, usually reproductions of recorders that we have from history. So whether that be from a recorder that's been preserved but is unplayable, or from archaeological finds and measurements. Historical recorders tend to have a slightly wider bore and single holes along the top, whereas modern recorders and German recorders have a slightly thinner bore and sometimes double holes. You can get modern recorders that look like historical recorders. For example, I have a wooden alto that is Renaissance inspired but has the same modern fingering that all my other modern fingered recorders has. Historical recorders that are historical and historically fingered tend to have issues with tuning a lot more than modern recorders do. So they have different fingerings across the registers for the same note. They have complicated chromatic fingerings, which usually end up with the recorder sounding flatter than it should across those accidental notes, and also slightly more breathy, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's also not necessarily a good thing. With the chromatic notes going flatter while you're playing, it's possibly going to be a problem if you're in an ensemble and you're playing with something that's equal temperament, because it will then point out that you are out of tune like a sore thumb. Historical recorders are also more non-standardised, or at least in the past they were, than modern recorders are. So if I went to one maker and I asked for a historical recorder and then I went to another one, the fingering systems wouldn't necessarily be the same. Historical recorders are, however, very good for people who want to do historically accurate performances or want to do reenactment and have an instrument that looks and sounds the part. It does come at the cost of very complicated fingering systems, slightly out of tune, you know. So, as I said, they tend to have a slightly wider bore and single holes, which is what this also has. But you can, as I said, get some that look the part but have the modern fingering system. Modern fingered recorders are derived from the original Baroque fingerings, but altered and adapted by Arnold Dolmetsch in the sort of early 1900s. He was very into his medieval Renaissance instruments and trying to help them regain popularity, and did a lot of service to the recorder by making it simpler across both octaves. So the pros for me for a modern fingered recorder is that the fingering system is consistent across the different octaves and has a much simpler second octave fingering system compared to the historical and the German fingering recorders. The accidentals are a lot more in tune, and it has double tone holes, which helps half holing at the bottom, especially if you've got smaller fingers. The modern recorder family all use the same fingering systems across them, so if I have my descant and I have my tenor, and I play an F sharp on this, and I have my modern fingered tenor, the F sharp should be exactly the same. Whereas with a historical model, that's not necessarily going to happen. The fingering systems have also been standardised, so if I have an Aulos versus a Yamaha versus a Mollenhauer and many other different recorder makes, they should have the same fingering if they are modern Baroque fingered. There are always going to be sort of some variants to that rule, but most of the notes are exactly the same. The German fingered recorder, in contrast, was developed by Peter Harlan in the 1920s. He developed the German fingering system in order to help make it simpler for younger children to learn in primary school. And while he did manage that with the scales of C and F, he managed to make it a lot more difficult for anything other than those two keys. It is not a recommended fingering system these days, but there are still people who make models of German recorders and plenty of older antique recorders around that use that fingering system. So to tell the difference between a modern Baroque and a German, mostly it is that the fourth hole on a German recorder is larger than the fifth hole, whereas the Baroque has a smaller fourth hole than it does fifth hole. I hope I just said that right. Some people believe that German recorders have single holes and only single holes, but there are models you can get that have the double tone holes, so if it's got double tone holes, don't assume it's Baroque. So the pros of a German fingered recorder are that it is simpler for beginner players to learn if they're learning C and F, and it has a standardised fingering system, so each German model should be the same. However, once you get out of C and F, the keys and the fingerings get very complex and very complicated and make it a little bit more difficult to play. The chromatic fingerings are more unstable than the modern counterpart and a lot more complex, so it's sort of verging on the historical line of your accidentals will probably go out of tune. It can only play a small number of keys easily, which isn't great for anyone who wants to play more than just C major and F major. And once you've learnt the fingering systems for a German recorder, if you then buy a Baroque recorder, you have to relearn a whole set of fingering systems, which isn't a terrible thing, but it can be difficult and it can be quite confusing. The chromatic notes of a German fingered recorder tend to be more breathy as well as unstable, and the same fingering cannot be applied across the family, unlike the modern counterpart. So I've got my descant German fingered recorder. If I had a tenor German fingered as well, I could not guarantee that the fingering for F on this is exactly the same as the fingering for F on a tenor. Essentially, I find that the modern Baroque recorder is a much more sensible fingering system to learn and a much more easy fingering system to learn compared to a historical or a German fingered recorder, purely because the fingering is the same across both octaves. And this is coming as someone who plays clarinet, where it's a little bit messed up compared to a flute or a saxophone. So, yeah. I hope that that was informative and helpful. If you have any further questions about recorder fingering systems, please put them in the comments and I will get back to you as soon as I can.